r/AskReddit. Doctors, nurses, and EMTs of Reddit. What is your best how the duck are you not dead moment? I work in a neurotrauma ICU. I had a failed suicide attempt come in where a guy tried to shoot himself through the top of the mouth. For whatever reason, he failed and the round ended up blowing his entire face off. The bullet and his teeth fragmented and were peppered all over the inside of his brain. Upon arrival, he was following commands and kept motioning with his fingers in the shape of a gun against his head. His family asked him if he's saying he wanted to shoot himself again, to which he shook his head yes. From this, the family decided that they wanted to withdraw all life-preserving measures and just let him go. It took almost a week before his brain edema became severe enough for him to herniate and die. This is where assisted suicide should be necessary. That would be one of the worst ways to go. I sincerely hope he was ducking flying on morphine that whole time. Otherwise an entire week of even lucid consciousness seems like cruel and unusual punishment. He had teeth in his brain. Guy with psych issues tried to kill himself by swallowing 4 razor blades. Don't know why they opted to not surgically retrieve them. But guy sat up in our ICU for about a week until he passed all of them. I still can't believe they didn't shred his insides. My schizophrenic aunt swallowed 2 razor blades and a few nails one day. No bleeding nowhere. Until the next day she complained about having a stomachache, so my grandma brought her to the hospital, got a scan of the tummy, and it showed all the metals she had inside. Crazy stuff. Technically a human ceramical? Probably figured they'd cause more damage perforation trying to run the bowel. Not any of the things mentioned above, but when I was deployed to Afghanistan, a lot of the other soldiers would end up getting hurt in combat disproportionately to everyone else. Once I saw this guy come back from the front who had been shot from armpit to armpit, shot in the head and stepped on a small IED that blew his leg off as well as one of his hands. He had lacerations all over and was bleeding quite bad. The other medics and doctors didn't even bother to put a tourniquet on his leg. They just sent him on over to us with basically no first aid done. All of this while being transferred from heli to heli and an hour and passing by. Somehow he made it to us alive and sort of coherent enough to look around. Besides the missing leg and his arms being ducked up, he lived and was okay. I saw a nurse that completed that did pretty much the same thing. Although her noose didn't break and she was able to take drugs from her job that would have done the job all on their own. Medical professionals don't play around when they go for suicide. We had a lady give herself a massive potassium bolus in a bathroom at a facility near me. Gone before they ever found her. Task failed successfully. A woman stuck in her bathtub for 3 days. Standing water. Skin sloughing. Totally dehydrated. She looked dead. Worst part, in an effort to unclog the tub, she had been pouring Drano into the water she was sitting in. She was also huge, so getting her out of there was a ducking mess. Once we finally did, she told the medic she was fine and didn't want to go to the hospital. We had to convince her. Unreal. Oh god, the image conjured into my head from that description is not good. Thankfully for you, it's much more difficult to imagine the smell. I won't describe it. I have almost no sense of smell. Working in emergency medicine has never made me regret that deficiency. I had a young guy, mid-20s, involved in a motor vehicle accident. He was alert and conscious despite the high impact injury. CT scan of his brain showed a massive subdural hemorrhage, which if it was in any other person, would have caused a midline shift. The brain matter gets pushed to the other side, i.e. left to right or vice versa. Luckily for him, he had a skull fracture at the area of the bleed, which acted as a burr hole, a medical procedure that we perform to prevent such midline shift from happening, thus saving his life, or his brain, for that matter. Incidental pressure release, oddly fortunate. Guy was working at a factory. Somehow there was an accident and a 2 inches wide 3 feet long board got shot through his head, entered through tip of his nose and exited just below his skull on the right side. Face was a mess. Came in from another hospital intubated to see if our neurosurgeon could remove the board. We all assumed he was likely neurologically devastated permanently. We cut down the board and took him to CT to see what we were dealing with. As we were waiting for CT to result, we realized guy's sedation had worn off and he was awake and could follow commands. You couldn't tell he was awake because his face was so swollen and macerated. We quickly reseated him. Turns out board missed nearly everything important. Messed up his internal carotid and lateral mass of C1 vertebrae, but missed his spinal cord by about 2 millimeters. He walked out of the hospital 5 days later after several big surgeries to fix his face and IJ. Neurosurgeon said he'd have a crooked neck forever but otherwise would be fine. Holy duck, that's insane. Worked as a phleb tech in a hospital for a while. Craziest thing I ever saw was this guy that came in having overdosed on drugs. What drugs, you ask? Literally all of them. Alcohol, cocaine, MDMA, opioids, benzodiazepines, K2, and a myriad of other things. I went to draw his blood for some tests and he asked me if I could get him more drugs from the nurse. I told him he would need to talk to the nurse about that. I ended up having to draw blood from the palm of his hand because his veins were so short. 'Twas a fun night. I had a friend who used to be on some intense drugs. At one point he had to have blood drawn and he took the needle from the nurse and put it in himself after they missed the vein twice. What drugs did you use? Yes. Just transfuse some of his blood for instant party mode and hepatitis. Triple gunshot wound rolled in one night. First guy was shot in the butt. Second guy shot in the arm. Third got shot dead center of his chest. I sent the butt guy to my least experienced team. The arm guy had some difficulty breathing, so you figured bullet traveled to his lungs, so I sent him to my more experienced team. Then I saw the third guy with a big red circle of blood in the middle of his chest and knew that he was gonna be mine. Chest x-ray was negative. No hemo or pneumo, but also no bullet. Rushed him to CT. Nothing. Shipped him to the local trauma center. A friend who works there said they let him sober up and then sent him home. Butt guy. Where the heck did the bullet go? Sorry for the long read. I'm an EMT in a really diverse area. We get toned out for a gunshot wound. With no updates. My squad runs 2 ambulances on all gunshot wounds. I was on the backup truck. We get on scene and see a large crowd of people all screaming and crying. The cops point us to this kid who is holding his hand in his face. He has no obvious injuries until he looked up at us. Blood just started to pool out of his head. This kid was shot in the face but was still able to talk to us. He was losing an unhealthy amount of blood, so we very quickly got him in the truck and called for a bird helicopter. As we are loading him in the back, he asked us, "Why am I alive?" Those words stick with me. No one had an answer for him. We quickly start bandaging the wound. It's a small hole right above his eye. We can't find an exit wound and suspect the bullet is still inside of his head. He is bleeding so much that any piece of gauze is immediately soaked. We get a trauma dressing on the wound and it's barely working. Medics arrive and start with their ives and fluids. The helicopter finally arrived and we were able to ship him to a good hospital. We later find out that the kid was shooting a rap video of his friend on his phone when the gun went off. The bullet traveled through the phone, struck him above the eye and started to bounce around in his head. The bullet exited below the kid's eye. We didn't see that hole from the amount of blood. When we packed the trauma dressing, it applied pressure to both wounds. The kid is expecting to make a full recover, but will most likely never see out of that eye again. I think about that kid a lot. I hope he is doing better now. And this is why we don't use loaded guns in our videos. Right, kids? Nobody watching the video can tell that it's unloaded. I promise. My mother stabilized the neck of a drunk teenager that fell 40 feet out of a tree. He landed on a rock face up and split his skull in half. I met him years after this incident and had to get a metal plate on his skull. My mother described holding his neck and said she had to hold back vomiting because of how the back of his head was mush. Her gloved hands basically were holding a pile of shattered brain, bone, and skin, yet he was alive. She met him and said she was happy she could help, but told me later she was sad he turned out a moron. Still fully functioning but a barfly. Edit. 1k upvotes. Thank you folks. Was it obviously from the accident or was he just a dumbass in general? Perhaps this is answered by the fact that he was drunk and 40 feet up a tree to start with. People do dumb things, but sometimes they learn and grow. As a teenager, my brother did many things a lot dumber than this. Now he works for NASA. Their floors have never been cleaner. They had us in the first half. Not gonna lie. Not one of the above, but in my line of work I met someone who had attempted suicide 7 times that could have reasonably led to her death. I was amazed that she had been saved so many times. Sad she kept attempting it all those times though. Extremely sad. I don't think those were the only 7 times. I mistyped when I posted last night. I should have said she inspired me to get into my line of work. I knew her in high school and found out when I was in college that she had died. A scribe here. We had a young guy come in with his girlfriend complaining of feeling slightly short of breath. He seemed pretty low acuity, so he ended up on a wall bed. I was pretty busy that night so he sat for a while. All of a sudden the nurse runs up to me and the doc and says this guy has a tension pneumothorax, collapsed lung. We check his vitals and they're all surprisingly normal. Pulse ox was 95 plus. HR was sub 100. Meanwhile this guy is literally just snapping selfies with his girlfriend. We did an XR later on, and boy he had a seriously collapsed lung, but was somehow just chillin' like nothing was wrong. I was a nurse at my county's prison. The area was having drug busts every 2 or 3 days it seemed. We get a batch of 10 in and everyone cleared perfectly except for this one woman. She was nodding in and out of consciousness and slurred her words. So I get one of the COs to obtain a urine sample to do a spot drug test. Sure enough the whole test lit up. So she's placed in detox for a few days and then we would retest her. A few days pass and she's not getting any better. In fact she got a lot worse. So we drug test her again and the test came back positive for everything from THC to benzodiazepines. I have the CO search her thoroughly in case we missed something and sure enough this lady had 2 extra large condoms stuffed up her jail purse and they both were torn open and her vaginal canal was absorbing all those drugs. We counted a total of 200 pills she was carrying. By all rights this girl should have been dead but she recovered after that. Shotgun to the balls via wife who found her husband was cheating. Edit. Here's the story. I'm an EMT and we got a house call for a guy screaming bloody murder. When we arrived we saw the wife open the door. Calmly. Looked like she was in shock with wide eyes and stiff movements. Led us to the bathroom where we find her husband crying. Bent over and wobbly. Holding one of his balls in his hand half torn and the other practically a bloody strand. Crying as you see shots on his inner thigh and his balls so frail if he let go they would just rip off. We turn around to see the wife holding a shotgun. Calmly, in shock, on the bed, saying in a calm voice over and over again I did it, I did it, I did it over and over again. The police officers with us brought their guns out and detailed the woman. The whole bathroom was such a mess and this all happened in the span of a few minutes. I want to hear more about this one. Former EMT, Canada. Guy crashed his motocross bike on course. Either an aneurysm caused the crash, or the crash caused the aneurysm. Either way his brain was so swollen it was pushing out the base of his skull. His body was posturing, punctured lung, etc. We booked it to the nearest and fully expected he'd passed away. Unexpectedly saw him approximately 6 months later in rehab in the same hospital. He was in pretty much a vegetative state but alive. I found out later he eventually passed away in a palliative care facility but he got 1.5 years to say goodbye to his kids and wife. Was he wearing a helmet? Yep. All protective gear required while on course. Damn. That must have been some accident for him to be wearing everything proper and still get so jacked up. If he hadn't been he definitely wouldn't have gotten the chance to say goodbye. Being in a vegetative state you aren't saying much to anyone. You are existing until your body gives out. Poor man and poor family having to go through that. Going back a decade or 2. Brand new into nursing in prison. We had a guy that was brought into the prison care room that was apprehended by the police dogs. He was high on crack during getting caught. He had staples running down on almost all appendages of his body and his scalp. First response of the doctor: how the duck did you not bleed to death, young man? Young man that now looks like Frankenstein. Maybe the crack slowed the bleeding. Veterinary professional working in emergency and critical care here. Work in LA and we've had a busy week with the recent earthquakes. Had a small dog come in after falling off of the balcony of a 5th-story apartment. The dog freaked out after the building started shaking. Also, this little guy is blind and has a history of seizures, diabetes and is 11 years old with no teeth. Come in. We stabilize him. And 10 minutes later his tail is wagging and he is licking us. Boggles my brain. But I'm glad this one had a happy ending. But still, WTF and how? John Wick is happy. One time when someone called about having something in the ass, he just wanted it out and did not want to go to the hospital. The thing stuck in his butt didn't look like any besides a little handle. So our medic went over and pulled it out quick and hard. It made a horrific noise that I can't describe. It turns out to be a 20 inches ladle. We stood there dumbfounded while this guy screams in agony. So we decided to take him to the hospital. I have some other stores if you guys want to hear them, just ask. Point blank suicide attempt with pistol to the temple. Patient lived but had bilateral enucleation. In other words, his eyeballs are gone and has memory span of about 10 minutes, alongside the mind of a child. And interestingly, he often gets hypothermic down to 94-95 or spikes a fever for no reason beyond he must have hit the part of his brain that controls temperature regulation. Saw him a long time ago, years after his attempt. Pleasant guy who lived in a group home and came in for various complications. Crazy looking CT of his head and obviously malformed skull face. Very few people would ever live through that. It's weird to think about, but maybe he's happier now. I imagine having the mind of a child and not being able to remember any past trauma could be better than being so depressed he attempted suicide. Thanks for watching, mate. Make sure to smash that like button for more high quality content.